Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on the final day of his two-day visit in China. He concluded more than 5 hours of meeting with Foreign Minister Qin Gang yesterday.
Both sides describe the talks as candid and constructive, but they say deep differences remain. Mr. Blinken is due to meet Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi today and possibly even President Xi Jinping.
All right, we are joined by Malcolm Davis, senior analyst from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute this morning. He is speaking to us from Canberra. Malcolm, both sides saying talks were candid and constructive, but didn't appear to agree on much beyond that. Mr. Qin should visit Washington. Should we see this as a positive sign?
Look, I think any dialogue is positive. I don't think we should get our hopes up that some sort of major breakthrough is going to happen in this relationship over a series of meetings. China has incredibly vast strategic ambitions, many of which conflict with US geostrategic interests and the interests of its allies. And so there's no way to bridge that gap. We can establish dialogues, we can put down what the Biden administration talks of guardrails, but ultimately it's China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in relation to Taiwan and also in the South China Sea, that is really the cause of the tensions at the moment.
Yeah, Malcolm, at the end of the day, Beijing and Washington, they deeply distrust each other. And it's been said that nations don't shake hands with each other, but people do. Does there need to be a more personal gesture here? One observer, for example, has suggested Blinken have breakfast at a local food stand. Is that going to make a difference?
No, not really, in the sense that China's goal here in the long term is to emerge as the dominant actor in the Indo-Pacific region and ultimately see the retrenchment of US strategic primacy. Okay, so that would mean essentially the US is no longer the dominant actor. Maybe it doesn't have a dominant or even a significant presence in the Western Pacific, Eastern Asia region. China has that presence. China sets the rules. And clearly the US is not about to accept that sort of big change in its strategic circumstances that would be hugely disadvantageous to the US interests. So the challenge is systemic in the sense that China is making a systemic challenge to the United States in every respect. The US is pushing back. China regards the US as a declining power. The US is not a declining power, but it does have a real challenge on its hands. The very first challenge that it's had since the Cold War of that sort of level of significance. And so this is the strategic competition that we're now in. It's going to last decades. It's not going to be resolved over a breakfast, let alone anything else. And I think we just have to try and manage this competition as best as we can to avoid the worst outcomes, which of course is all-out war.
Yeah, on that military side, Malcolm, we've seen some near misses in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, between naval ships and fighter jets. But how useful would Blinken's visit be in at least toning down that temperature on these sensitive issues?
Well, look, we've had discussions with the Chinese previously where supposedly we've shaken hands and had dialogue and so forth. But within a matter of months, we're once again having incidents occurring in the South China Sea. And I don't see those sort of incidents stopping in the South China Sea. The Chinese are determined to control the South China Sea. The US and its allies are determined to challenge that control because it is, after all, international waters and international airspace. It's not Chinese territorial waters, irrespective of what the Chinese claim. And the second point, of course, is Taiwan and the risk that China will use military force against Taiwan potentially as early as the second half of this decade. And the US has a fundamental choice to make in regards to Taiwan, because if it does nothing, its strategic credibility in the Indo-Pacific region is completely gone. And that would be calamitous for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. But if it does respond, if it does intervene to support Taiwan, then we're looking at that major war between China and the United States. So this is a real devil's dilemma that the US is going to be facing over Taiwan. And I don't think any diplomatic discussions are going to alleviate that, because the interests and the stakes involved around Taiwan are so great for both sides that it's very difficult to see a way back from that.
It's a complicated relationship, too, because economic issues have become entangled with national security concerns, and there is no sign yet of reducing Trump-era tariffs. Should they be looked at again, Malcolm?
No, in the sense that, the Chinese have to give something. It shouldn't just be a case of the Americans giving concessions and then the Chinese taking those and pocketing those and giving nothing in return. So I do think the Chinese maybe, in return for America easing tariffs and sanctions, should actually sit down and make constructive contributions to easing tension and ensuring stability. So far, there's no sign of that. If all it is the case of America providing concession after concession in the hope that Beijing will moderate its stance, they're going to be sorely disappointed, because China is not going to do that. We've tried that in the past, where we've engaged with China and given them all sorts of opportunities, entry into the World Trade Organization and so forth. And all that's happened is that China has taken those concessions and then continued to develop its military and continue to behave aggressively in the South China Sea and also against Taiwan. So it has to be a quid pro quo. It can't be America providing the concessions and China pocketing those and then continuing to further its objectives at the expense of American interests.
Malcolm, you earlier said that there's no way to bridge the widening gap between these two superpowers. I just want to get your take on how the Biden administration has been handling its relations with China. I mean, there have been voices of doubt, some even calling a zombie engagement that has failed for 30 years. Do they have a point?
I think there is a risk that they do. If the Biden administration, in a desire to provide guardrails and provide some sort of stable relationship with Beijing, falls back on that approach of, as I said, providing concessions after concessions, and then China does nothing in response that is contributes to that stability, then we do run the risk of repeating history here. And we do run the risk of basically just simply emboldening China's ambitions, because they think that essentially, if we act more aggressively, the Americans will give us more concessions. That's the worst possible scenario and the worst possible policy that the Biden administration could pursue. So I do think it has to be a balanced one. We have to go into this relationship with a willingness to engage and a willingness to talk to the Chinese, but do so from a position whereby the US and its allies are going to defend their key interests. They're not going to accept a Chinese encroachment that would see the end of US strategic primacy in the region. And certainly, we have some fundamental decisions to make in regards to Taiwan, and we also need to stand firm in the South China Sea. We cannot afford to allow China to control the South China Sea as its own territorial waters, and we cannot afford to accept China imposing unification on the Taiwanese people against their wishes.
Before we let you go, Malcolm, I want to look ahead over the next day or two, a few days. Today, Blinken is set to meet Wang Yi, President Xi's diplomacy advisor. How likely do you think is a Xi-Blinken meeting? And if that doesn't happen, would it be considered an insult?
I don't know whether it would be considered an insult. I mean, obviously, Blinken is Secretary of State, Xi is the head of state. I think that it would be likely that a meeting with Xi could happen briefly that would set the stage for Biden then going to Beijing. But I think that we shouldn't get too wrapped up in the signals here. We've got to remember the big geostrategic picture here. What are China's ambitions? What are their intentions? What are their interests? We understand exactly what the Chinese want. What we have to do is use dialogue and use diplomacy to manage the relationship as possible. And that's where regular discussion and communication really come to the fore. If we can have those discussions, that does help. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that somehow the Chinese are going to moderate their behavior or give up on their ambitions regarding the South China Sea or Taiwan. And I think that's where the concept of integrated deterrence comes to the fore. We have to stand firm, and the US and its allies have to work together to deter China so that President Xi does not decide to use force either against Taiwan or in the South China Sea or elsewhere.
All right, Malcolm, I appreciate your time and your expertise. As always, we've been speaking with Malcolm Davis, senior analyst from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.